Alright, so today we're going to be putting transmission in this Versa Note. Unfortunately, I lost the video of me removing the transmission, so this will be a transmission installation, so let's jump straight to it. Alright, I'm a little out of breath now. But anyways, we got the transmission off the trans jack sitting on the floor. Got our new transmission over here. And once I get that picked up and set on the jack, we'll go from there. But the goal is to get that on here and then line it up with that and then bolt her back together. Okay, let's get her done. Alright, we got her on there, getting ready to get everything lined up. Now, the trick I like to use is I'll try to find one of my torque converter holes, because these are studs, and I'll kind of look, I'll find a bolt on the back of my engine block where my bell housing bolts up, and I'll kind of look at where it is in correlation with this hole here, and then I'll come to my torque converter. So there's those holes, and I try to get them about the same spot. So when I go up there, it's going to be pretty close, if not right on. So jack it on up and see how it lines up. And thanks to some movie magic here, we got her up there, got some bolts started, and I did not have to move that flex plate or torque converter at all. That actually lined right up. So next thing I'll do is just make sure all dial pins are lined up right and get her squeezed together, tighten the bolts up. And then we'll line up that motor mount up there, crawl up there with a ladder, throw a bolt on it, and she'll hang there by herself without any of this down here supporting it. So let me get that done. Alright, so we got a new development. That's our engine mount. Should be attached there. This is why I don't like going behind people that's already done stuff. They ripped it. When I went to put it back in, it just lifted straight up. And then their fix was to just put the bolt back on top of it, let it lay there. Yeah, that's not going to be our fix. We're going to recommend that they replace this. Whether they do or not, that's on them. But, hang on. Working in a dealership, whenever I work on a car, I want to return it back to as close as I can to factory. So when I'm done, all these harnesses, everything, you're not going to be able to tell I took this out except for the nice shiny transmission that's going to be there. So when I find stuff like this, it needs to be replaced, or it's not going to perform like it did when it came from the factory. Same with the missing bolts I found on here, the flex plate being overheated, possibly warped, which they didn't want to replace, but I don't think they're going to have much choice on this one. So we'll get back with y'all after they make their decision here. Till then we'll move on to this one. We'll see. Alright, it is now 2 days later. We're finally getting back on our transmission install on this Versa Note. Finally got my motor mount in. So I'm going to climb up there, put this on, tighten everything up, and we can get rid of all this stuff supporting this engine. So let me get this on here. So this is what we're actually replacing. This mount right here, you can see the whole top of it is tore out. Kind of sketchy doing it standing on a ladder. But let me pop them two bolts or two nuts off and get that out and get our new one sitting in there. Alright, got our nuts off. We can lift this up out of here. Yeah, that wasn't gonna hold nothing. Grab our new one, and we'll just lay her down in there. Like so. Throw them 2 nuts on, jack it up a little bit, and we'll throw this nut on top here, and that'll support our transmission. Alright, we got those 2 nuts in, and we'll run this down. It's actually going to pull that stud in here. There's little splines on that stud that it's got to pull up in there. Alright, so that's on there now. We can go down to the bottom and let everything down. Alright. Here we are down here. We can let this loose. And now our motor is setting in there, supported by its own mounts. Alright. Alright, we got all our bolts tight. There's actually one, you're not going to be able to see it because I can put that back on the tape. Yep, there's actually one way up top there. But you cannot hardly, it's not that one, it's, there you go, right there at the top. That you can barely get to. So if you're ever taking a transmission out of one of these and you can't figure out why it won't separate, it's probably that bolt right up there. Alright, so now we'll go ahead and pop our CV axles back in, get our front end put back together, then I'll bring y'all back for some of that, and also get all these, get our harness connected to our transmission, our cooler lines right here. These cooler lines we can't connect till we get our front end back on and our radiator back in. Okay. Let's keep going. Alright, so we're about to throw our CV axles back in. One important thing, this area right here is a sealing surface. So whenever we go to put it back together, we just want to clean any dirt or anything that might be on there off. In fact, we're going to clean this whole end off. All that goes inside of our transmission into our differential. We get that good and clean and slide it in. Alright, so what I'm doing here, I got my CV axle lined up, splines are lined up. Now what I'm going to do is you got a little plunge joint right here, and I'm going to use that kind of like a slide hammer, and I'm going to bump that axle in like so, and that gets our passenger side CV axle back in. Still got to put it back up in here, fold all this up, get to that. Alright, so we got both our CV axles back in. We've got all this tightened up. Got our brake line retainers put back on. Wheel speed sensors put back in. All our stuff to do here is put our nut on the front of that. We'll come around here. We've started hooking our connectors back up. Got our main connector plugged in. Got to hook this ground up over here. But I want to show you this right here. Whenever I do this, I want this to look like it came from the factory. So if you look, you will find everywhere that these are supposed to go in. You see these, they look like bolt holes. And there are actually threaded bolt holes, but what's going to go in is these little Christmas tree clips. You put those in everywhere. And now that harness is routed exactly the way it was whenever it came from the factory. And that's what we want. Next, I got to hook these lines up. These are for our trans cooler. This is where coolant flows through these lines. Transmission fluid flows through these lines. So, we finished getting this harness kind of routed, looking better. Got to get our torque converter bolts inside here, and we'll get to getting this thing put back in. Still got quite a bit of bell housing bolts up top and our starter bolts. I do believe some of those were missing when I took them out. Alright, so we got our bell housing bolts in, got our starter put on, got all our bolts in our starter. went ahead and put, there's 2 bolts up here. There's one that hides down up underneath here. And then there's another one back here. You can't really see them, you gotta feel for them. But there's only 2 bolts up top, and then one at the top of your starter. And that's all your bolts up top. Got all this put back on. Got our harness routed across the top. Going to our sensors on the back of the transmission. And now we're getting ready to put everything back up top. I'll get back with you when we get all that on there. So we got our battery tray back in. Harness is correctly routed. This is some extra stuff right here for, it's basically a GPS. Then get our intake back on. Normally how I do this is I take the intake off. This whole front end would not be off the car. Pull the starter, and I get down here with this tool right here and a shallow 14mm socket, and I can get to those torque converter bolts. But because our old torque converter bolts, let's see if I can find it, were rounded off like that, that wasn't an option. So I basically had 2 choices: do this, drop the engine. I went with this. So let me get this intake throw back on.
Don wasn't happy about Saturday.
Got our buddy Brad over here. All right, so we got our intake put back on, got our throttle body on, routed all our harnesses correctly. Don't forget about these bolts right here when you put your intake on, especially when you're taking the intake off. There's 2. You get all these out and be prying on the intake. You still got 2 bolts in it. Don't do that. And whenever you put it back on, make sure you put them bolts back in. All right, so next we're gonna throw our breather on here, and we'll get back to y'all when we have that on there. She's coming on together. All right, breather's back on. Plug in my mass airflow sensor here. Flip this in where it belongs. And the installation of the transmission is done. So at this point, we're ready to put our front end back on. What I'd recommend is, if you're doing this at home, go ahead, you see where your dipstick tube is. Okay, these are not really meant to be filled from the top. They're meant to be filled from the bottom with a pump. But you can pop this out. If you're doing this at home, go ahead and add you about 6.5, 7 quarts of transmission fluid in through here. So go ahead and get that out of the way, because it's going to be nearly impossible to get to once we get the front end back on. So if you're doing it at home, I would highly recommend do it that way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and finish getting some of this front end put on. We got to get a radiator and all that in, get our condenser put in, so we can fire this thing up, set our transmission fluid level. So that would be our next step. All right, so I did leave out one important detail. If you are filling it this way, clamp these off so you don't lose any fluid. I just stuck some bolts in there, put my clamps on. Let me get back to filling her up. Now, I am doing it this way because it's easier than using that pump, try to pump it in through the bottom. It's a hand pump, and you got to sit there and work it the whole time. So let me finish this up. What we're going to do is go ahead and get our lower radiator support, or our radiator support on. We're going to put that on with our front bumper, all as an assembly. And that's pretty simple. It's just going to line up right here with these bolts. And we got some bolts on the bottom for our radiator support. So let me get that third on there. And we'll come back and show you how that looks. That there setting in place. I've got a bolt started on each side. Now I'm going to raise it up, put our bolts in the bottom, come back up here and tighten these. This is where our bottom bolts is. We got one right here. You can see that, but it's just right through here on the splash shield, accessible. We got to drop our splash shield down here, and there's another one on the bottom. Same thing on the other side. One down here, one right here through our splash shield. That's going to take our radiator support, our lower radiator support right on out. Get those 2 out, get these out, and then we got a connector in here for our active grill shutter. All that's, I can take all that out as one assembly. We got that put back on. Now next step's gonna be drop a radiator in. Just gonna go set right down there on the bottom there. Hook our hoses up, hook our trans lines up. Get our top mount on, and then all we'll have to do is put our bumper on. So, let me grab that radiator and start working it in there. Alright, so here's our radiator. As you can see, we removed it as a whole assembly with the fan shroud and the condenser. So we can just drop all that in there, start bolting everything up. Unfortunately, also a two-hand job, so I'm gonna get a tripod eventually. Got everything back on, our radiator's in. Go ahead and put our top radiator mount on, which is also got our hood latch, our crash sensor, all that on it. We are ready to put coolant in it. So I've got this fancy little gadget here, which is gonna pull a vacuum on the whole coolant system. It'll also tell us if we got any leaks, which is nice. So we'll let that vacuum down. Very, very valuable tool here. Don't have to worry about trying to bleed the coolant system when you use this. You're just going to suck all the air out. Alright, once we do that, we can kind of let it set for a little while and see if we lose the vacuum. Then we can get our bucket over here for coolant. This works is I just stick my hose in here. There's a vacuum on there. I'm going to open this valve. We're going to get coolant. Just going to suck it right out of there into our radiator. That's simple. So let me get this filled up. Alright, we got the coolant in her. It is time to fire her up. Set our trans fluid level. So what we're going to do, we're going to go in here. I think this battery ain't dead. We're going to go in here and like we normally do, we'll hook up our console. And if our battery isn't dead, it is. Let me get a jump box and we'll start this thing up. Alright, got a little jump box hooked up. Now let's see if she'll start. There we go. She's running. Alright, we'll let it up. Start letting fluid drain out the transmission. Alright, so we're going to take our drain plug out right here. There's actually a tube inside of there like that that's going to set at our correct fluid level with the engine running. And then I'm going to go over here to console and I'm going to pull up our transmission fluid temperature. Alright, so we're going to watch that. We want it to be between about 110, 120. With slow drips coming out of there. Gotta wait for that. I think while I'm waiting there, I'm going to start putting my bumper on. So we can get started on that. So we're at about 115. A nice little trickle. We'll go ahead and put our plug back in. Or drop it. It's hard to do on camera. There we go. I'll tighten that up. Alright, looks like a car again, and it is running. There's a few things I got to do. I've got to do some programming with TCM. Got to clear out all the memory from the old transmission that was in it. Let it learn basically the clutch point settings on this one, so kind of when to engage the clutches and how hard to engage the clutches. So it's not doing it too soft and burning up the clutches, and it's not doing it too hard and snatching the crap out of you. So I've got to go through that process, and then as long as it's shifting good, everything's fine, this car will be done and ready to go. Alright, so if you were doing this job yourself, you've done installed the transmission. this is the point where you need to bring it to us. First thing we got to do here now is do a TCM reprogram. That's going to update the TCM so that we can do our clutch point relearn. And also it's going to set some new logic in the TCM for some codes that can set whenever we get a shutter or a judder in transmission. It'll be able to set a code for that. So that's going to be our first step. We'll let that go ahead and finish, and then we'll start doing our clutch point relearns. And well, first we're going to have to clear all of our data in our TCM from our old transmission, and then we'll do our clutch point relearns. Let's let that finish. All right, here we are. So we got all these options. We're going to go to the race calibration data. Start. Follow our directions on the screen. This is usually pretty quick. Start. Completed. Now we can go in and do our auxiliary clutch point line. Hold our brake, make sure our car is warmed up, and it is. We're in neutral, hit start, dropper and drive. And this does take a few minutes, so we'll let this finish, bring you back for the test drive. All right, here we go. See if she's gonna back out of here. Oh yeah. We are out of the shop. Everything's working, no check engine lights. Shifting like we should. Sounds like we got a bad wheel bearing, but we've never got to drive this car because it wouldn't move. Oh yeah, we got some bad wheel bearings. Place to get out of. Oh yeah. Alright, well we'll try to find out which wheel bearings are bad. If y'all like the video, please subscribe, ring the bell. Y'all get notifications every time I post a new one. I believe my next one is actually going to be rebuilding one of these CVTs. Thanks for watching.